All right, guys. So chapter 3, called Jung, the undiscovered self. So let's keep going. So chapter 3 is the position of the West on the question of religion. So confronting this development in the 20th century of our Christian era, the Western world stands with its heritage of Roman law. The treasures of Judeo-Christian ethics grounded on metaphysics and its ideal of the inalienable rights of man. Anxiously it asks itself the question, how can this development be brought to a standstill or put into reverse? It is useless to pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopian and to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable, because in the first place the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain, and in the second place, any economic principles you like can be put into practice so as long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. You can carry through any social and economic reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million peasants starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. A state of this kind has no social or economic crisis to fear, so long as its power is intact, that is to say, so long as there is a well-disciplined and well-fed police army in the offing. It can maintain its existence for an indefinitely long period and can go on increasing its power to an indefinite extent. In accordance with its excess birth rate, it can raise the number of its unpaid workers almost at will in order to compete with its rivals regardless of the world market, which is to a large measure dependent on wages. A real danger can come to it only from outside through the threat of military attack, but this risk grows less every year, firstly because the war potential of the dictator states is steadily increasing, and secondly because the West cannot afford to arouse latent Russian or Chinese nationalism and chauvinism by an attack which would divert their well-meant undertakings into a hopelessly wrong channel. So far as one can see, only one possibility remains, and that is a breakdown of power from within, which must, however, be left to follow its own inner development. Any support from outside at present would have little effect in view of the existing security measures and the danger of nationalistic reactions. The absolute state has an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding in matters of foreign policy, and these in their turn can count on a fifth column who are guaranteed asylum under the laws and constitution of the Western states. In addition, the communes of believers, very strong in places, considerably weaken Western governments' powers of decision, whereas the West has no opportunity to exert a similar influence on our rivals. Though we are probably not wrong in surmising that there was a certain amount of opposition among the masses in the East. There are always upright and truth-loving people to whom lying and tyranny are hateful, but one cannot judge whether they exert any decisive influence on the masses under the police regimes. So asterisk. Recent events in Poland and Hungary have shown that this opposition is more considerable than could have been foreseen. In view of this uncomfortable situation, the question is heard again and again in the West. What can we do to counter this threat from the East? Even though the West has considerable industrial power and a sizable defense potential at its command, we cannot rest content with this, for we know that even the biggest guns and the heaviest industry with its relatively high living standard are not enough to check the psychic infection spread by religious fanaticism. The West has unfortunately not yet awakened to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues delivered with so much enthusiasm is mere sound and fury. It is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. We are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational or moral arguments, but with an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times, and these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflection and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexiphoric, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. Unhappily, the little word should, which never fails to appear in this connection, points to a certain weakness, if not the absence of this desideratum. Not only does the West lack a uniform faith, that could block the progress of a fanatical ideology, but as the father of Marxist philosophy, it makes use of exactly the same spiritual assumptions, the same arguments and aims. Although the churches in the West enjoy full freedom, they are not less full or empty than in the East, yet they exercise no noticeable influence on the broad course of politics. The disadvantage of a creed as a public institution is that it serves two masters. On the one hand, it derives its existence from the relationship of man to God, and on the other hand, it owes a duty to the state, i.e., to the world, in which connection it can appeal to the sane, render unto Caesar, and various other admonitions in the New Testament. In early times, and until comparatively recently, there was therefore talk of powers ordained by God. Romans 13:1. Today, this conception is antiquated. The churches stand for traditional collective convictions which in the case of many of their adherents are no longer based on their own inner experience, but on unreflecting belief, which is notoriously apt to disappear as soon as one begins thinking about it. The content of belief then becomes into collision with knowledge, and it often turns out that the irrationality of the former is no match for the ratioinations of the latter. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience, and where this is absent, even a strong faith which came miraculously as a gift of grace may depart equally miraculously. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to think that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place which instilled into us. That is trust and loyalty. This experience has a definite content that can be interpreted in terms of one or other of the denominational creeds, but the more this is so, the more the possibilities of these conflicts with knowledge mount up, which in themselves are quite pointless. That is to say, the standpoint of the creeds is archaic. They are full of impressive mythological symbolism, which if taken literally comes into insufferable conflict with knowledge. But if, for instance, the statement that Christ rose from the dead is to be understood not literally but symbolically, then it is capable of various interpretations that do not collide with knowledge and do not impair the meaning of the statement. The objection that understanding is symbolically puts an end to the Christian's hope of immortality is invalid, because long before the coming of Christianity, mankind believed in a life after death and therefore had no need of Easter event as a guarantee of immortality. The danger that a mythology understood too literally and as taught by the church will suddenly be repudiated, lock, stock, and barrel is today greater than ever. Is it not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood symbolically for once? It is still too early to say what might be the consequences of a general recognition of the fatal parallelism between the state religion of the Marxists and the state religion of the church. The absolutist claim of a Civitas Dei represented by man bears an unfortunate resemblance to the divinity of the state, and the moral conclusion drawn by Ignatius Loyola from the authority of the church, the end sanctifies the means, anticipates the lie as a political instrument in an exceedingly dangerous way. Both demand unqualified submission to faith, and thus curtail man's freedom, the one his freedom before God, and the other his freedom before the state, thereby digging the grave for the individual. The fragile existence of the individual, the unique carrier of life, is threatened on both sides despite their respective promises of spiritual material idols to come, and how many of us can in the long run fight against the proverbial wisdom of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Besides which, the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc, as I have explained above. What then has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately, except a variety of paths, all leading to one goal, which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. It requires no special effort to understanding to see where the communist ideology gets the certainty of its belief that time is on its side, and that the world is ripe for conversion. The facts speak a language that is all too plain in this respect. It will not help us in the West to shut our eyes to this and not recognize our fatal vulnerability. Anyone who has once learned to submit absolutely to a collective belief and to renounce his eternal right to freedom and the equally eternal duty of individual responsibility will persist in this attitude and will be able to set out with the same credulity and the same lack of criticism in the reverse direction if another and manifestly better belief is foisted upon his alleged idealism. What happened not so long ago to a civilized European nation? We accuse the Germans of having forgotten it all again already, but the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar might not happen elsewhere. It would not be surprising if it did, and if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided idea. America, which, o quae mutatio rerum, forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted, but in point of fact she is perhaps even more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific Jung with its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. And her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. The historical and humanistic type of education so sorely needed in such circumstances leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. Though Europe possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoisms and paralyzing skepticism. Common to both is the materialistic and collectivist goal, and both lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely an ideal which puts the individual human being in the center as the measure of all things. This idea alone is enough to arouse the most violent doubts and resistances on all sides, and one could almost go so far as to assert that the valuelessness of the individual in comparison with large numbers is the one belief that meets with universal and unanimous assent. To be sure, we all say that this is the century of the common man, that he is the Lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion only, and is counterbalanced by a reality which is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the war technique, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence, his spiritual and moral freedom, though guaranteed within limits, and one half of his world is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half it is abolished altogether. Finally, to add comedy to tragedy, this lord of the elements, this universal arbiter, hugs to his bosom notions which stamp his dignity as worthless and turn his autonomy into an absurdity. All his achievements and possessions do not make him bigger. On the contrary, they diminish him, as the fate of the factory worker under the rule of a just, in quotes, just distribution of goods clearly demonstrates. All his achievements and possessions do not make him bigger. On the contrary, they diminish him, as the fate of the factory worker under the rule of a, in quotes, just distribution of goods clearly demonstrates. I mean, he's making shit he can't ever obtain for himself.